And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. Are there questions?
Tell us what you know first.
Apparently so. Well, it is an interesting topic, the work of pensions and benefits, and you'll have some questions as we go along, and we want to address the one that you walked in the door with, because that's the most important question, right? What I have found out about questions is there's generally two kinds. There's the question that you don't mind asking in the larger group because the answer isn't going to impact you personally with regard to finance. And then there's the question that's probably more pressing, and it has to do with your personal situation. And you don't want to ask that out loud. And quite frankly, I don't want you asking that out loud, because we're going to have to share information that I probably can't share in the public setting. So we'll try to watch as we go along. If you have the questions that you want to ask that you're not at all concerned about the response publicly, we'll address those. But I'll also be hanging around after this is over at the break, and I've already talked to some folks ahead of time here about their personal situation, and we'll try to address those as well. So we'll kind of understand the ground rules there, and just because you don't get a general question about your situation addressed, we'll try to take care of that afterwards. Things change. I don't know if you've noticed it, maybe they don't change in your church. But what I've been recognizing is that over the last 35 years that I've been in the pensions office, things have changed a lot. And just about the time you think you understand how something's working or what the rules are or what the tax laws might be or the regulations, they change. And we all have to change and stay up on it. So one of the things that we find as we interact with folks is a common conversation is, well, I heard, okay, and then they'll tell us what they heard about P&B. And generally, what they heard was true 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But it's no longer true, and because things change, and the environments change, the economy changes, regulations change. So we'll hope today that we can kind of work through some of that and address some of the issues. So we'll start with some basics here, make sure we're kind of all understanding on the same plane here, the work of pensions and benefits and how we do our work in the Church of the Nazarene. I have the privilege of serving in this capacity. I get to serve with leaders of other denominations that do this kind of work for their denominations. And I can tell you the way that we do it in the Church of the Nazarene, the way that we structure pensions and benefits, the way we fund it, the way we pay, is different than is done in other denominations. And it tends to reflect our DNA as a denomination. And so one of the things that I found interesting is how we do what we do that reflects who we are. So we'll need to talk about some of that. So what is this thing, pensions and benefits? Well, we'll hope that the technology is going to cooperate. We actually had our beginning in 1919. And in fact, on October 4th of 2019, we will celebrate our 100th anniversary in pensions and benefits. So, and I can tell you this, it's being done differently today than it was 100 years ago, okay? But what we did 100 years ago reflected our DNA and our culture at that time. And so it's, in some ways it's changed, in other ways it hasn't. And what is our purpose? Well, we really serve two distinct groups. And it makes it it makes it interesting when we structure our communications and reach out to our constituent groups. We try to focus on which groups we're talking to. We serve ministerial and lay employees of USA congregations and districts, okay? So that would be the individuals who have income from and are employed by Nazarene organizations, Nazarene churches, Nazarene districts, Nazarene agencies. We recognize that we have a large constituent group, which is individuals who are employed by the church. But we also serve the USA congregations and districts in their roles as employers. And if you're pastoring or on staff, you're in kind of a unique role. You are a representative of both of those groups. You're probably an employee of the congregation, but you also represent that congregation, and that congregation is an employer. One of the challenges that we face is helping each congregation, first of all, understand their role as an employer, and then comply with all of the regulations and provisions that are required. That is not an easy task. And if you were to take a survey in any local church and just ask them randomly on any given Sunday, so what are you? As a church, what are you? We would get some wonderful responses. You know, we're the body of Christ. We're an expression. We're a community following Jesus. We're expressing the gospel in the community. There's all kinds of wonderful definitions of who they are as a church. Very few of them would say, well, we're an employer, right? And yet that's a big part of what every church is. It's a corporation, it has a board, and it probably has at least one employee, a pastor. And so that particular role is a challenge. So those are our two constituent groups that we work with. And then we have to have money to operate. Now, I tell the folks that I work with at the Global Ministry Center who do ministry in other things that I probably have a much easier job than they do in terms of translating what we do, okay? Because if I'm in a ministry area that provides curriculum or programming, I receive money through whatever funding source I'm funded, but then I turn that into a product or a service and give it back to the district or the local church. And so the dollars come in, I put together something and deliver it back, and the end user has to determine whether or not they got a good deal in there, right? One of the things about doing money with money, it's a much smaller loop. You know, we give money back. And it's much simpler for us. And so we have sources of funds that help us pay the benefits that we pay. And in any given year, we will pay between $42 and $46 million a year in benefits through the programs that we administer in Pensions and Benefits USA. And when you look at the assets that we have under management, I remind everybody that looks at our balance sheets, okay? Every dollar that you're looking at is already spoken for. Somebody's Social Security number and date of birth and address is attached to every one of those dollars. And so we have about $600+ billion of assets under management that we're responsible for, but it's not our money. It's your money, right? And so we share in this together. In fact, when we do our budget each year, and we present our budget to the Board of Pensions, it will show how many millions of dollars we are going to distribute in the next fiscal year. And next year, I think we're on, our budget is on track for around $45 million to be distributed. But we do a little pie chart. and we show how much of that is discretionary and how much of it is already determined by the benefit programs and contracts in place that we're responsible to administer. We have total discretion over less than 1% of the dollars that we will spend. We have total and partial discretion over about 1.3% of the dollars that we will spend. All the rest of it is determined by the source of the funds, other people's money. So when it comes to what do we do with what we get? Well, our big source of funding, of course, is the P&B fund. And last year, your district paid into the P&B fund a little over $149,000. Now, we've been tracking for quite a while, so what benefit on a district-by-district basis do districts get for what we do? And so we looked at the benefits that are paid back to the districts just from the P&B source funds, okay? Not from the dollars that are put into the 403B plan, not from the insurance premiums that people pay for the district, but what benefits were paid out of those P&B fund source dollars to the participants and people living in this district. And $225,767 approximately are the benefits that we were able to provide from the fund that was paid into with a little over $149,000. Well, if you were running on just a straight cash in, cash out basis, that would not be sustainable, right? But because over the years we have recognized that obligations were coming, we did put money away into trusts and reserves, and there are interest earnings and investment gains on that, and that has been the basis out of which we're able to pay the benefits. Okay. Yes, sir?
Your 225,767, will not that number decrease since we no longer, the newer pastures, we don't get a take, all we get is our 403s. So will that number decrease?
Actually, that includes some dollars that are paid out of those 403B accounts that are attributable to P&B fund dollars going in. So some of that 225 is money that was put into the 403B accounts. Some of that 225 is distributions from the P&B source money that came back to the individuals that participated.
Well, the 149,073 then, does it count the investments that the individual has made also to that
No.
account?
No.
Well, then that throws that number off then.
No. The dollars that are represented with 225 are dollars that were sourced from P&B fund sources over the years.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but as I know, because I missed out, I didn't get grandfathered in with, you know, you used to get $11 a year. Of course, that number changed all the way around, so that's obsolete for us. We will not get any of that money. We just get the 403. So there should be a reckoning in that balance one place or the other. And, you know, the 225 goes down.
Yeah, that includes benevolence, that includes life insurance, that includes disability insurance, it includes the P&B fund payments to retirees. It also includes distributions to retirees from those accounts. Okay? And so that's P&B fund sourcing. That's not the dollars that individuals put in, that's P&B fund sourcing. So I don't know if I answered your question correctly initially there.
Well, it makes more sense because I'm looking, of course, as I get closer, I've got 6 or 7 more years for retirement. So I'm doing all the figures and looking at everything. So.
Yeah. The point is, whether you're under the old plan or whether you're under the new plan, if in fact, in addition to what P&B fund sources is paying, you're not putting additional money in, it's always been that way. You're probably not going to have a sustainable retirement.
Well, you're not going to have nothing.
Yeah.
Because they only give you $250 now.
Yeah, it's not, yeah.
So $250 times 20 years of service, you do the math, with a little bit of interest, that's $250 a year. You'll have nothing to go out on.
You're going to have to put more in.
Yeah, a lot more.
Yeah.
Where it used to be 1,000, which now it's not. So.
Yeah, we'll talk through that.
I know that, I know.
Okay, there's an illustration, I think, that'll help you there. As I mentioned, you do have to be doing something yourself. I'm looking at the individual premiums and contributions, obviously, investment earnings, and then gifts. So those are the sources of funds that we have with which to pay benefits, okay? So, we have recognized over the years that if you're going to put together a foundational program as an individual or as an employer, okay? So we're talking both to employers and the individuals who serve those employers. Most benefit plans need to address 5 critical questions with regard to financial issues in order to be stable and address the basic risks. And those are pretty simple. What if I live too long? What if I die too soon? What if I become disabled? What if I get sick? And what if I get paid? The last one has to do with compensation structuring, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the session today. But what we have discovered is that if you can put together some kind of a benefit program that addresses these basic risks, you have the foundations in place. You've laid the foundations. And the way that we do pensions and benefits in the Church of the Nazarene is from the dollars that are paid in through the P&B fund, we seek to provide a basic life insurance policy, a basic disability policy, and some base contributions to a retirement account, okay? So 3 of the 5. The 4th one, what if I get paid, we also provide resources to help in compensation structuring on a tax-favored basis. What if I get sick is the challenging one. Used to be real concerned about the fact that we couldn't do that, and then I saw the federal government try to do it. And they can print money and raise taxes and not do it. So, we quit trying to print money back when we found out it was illegal. But you can't print money. We can't enforce tax payments, and so health plans are kind of a challenge. But those are the basic questions. And if a local church is going to be putting together compensation that is adequate and addressing the issues that are the risk for the parsonage families, then these are the issues that they need to have the basics covered. There are a lot of other pieces out there, but these are the basics. And so what we have done is structured the system so that we can help both the individual and the employer have the basics covered. And that's what we do. A lot of stuff that goes with it, but those are the basics. So what do we provide? Well, we provide critical information uniquely focused to meet your needs. I was talking to somebody before the session, and they were talking about, they went out online and checked on something and were kind of amazed at all the answers they got. And it's interesting over the years how I've watched this happen. Years ago, the challenge was getting information, right? Back when we were kind of a print-based operation and we relied on books and pamphlets and print materials to communicate for the most part. Getting information on ministers' compensation was a challenge. Getting information is not a problem anymore. All you have to do is go out and Google, right? You just pull up the search engine and you put in ministers' compensation in there, and you're going to get all kinds of information. The problem now is, what information can I trust? Because not everything that comes up, and I think what the person said was, you can't trust everything you read on the internet. Really? Yeah. And especially when it comes to ministerial compensation and taxes and retirement planning and investments and all of that. The problem anymore is not information. The problem is the right information. So what we try to do is provide critical information uniquely focused to meet the needs of both the individuals and the local church employers. And that sorting through all that's out there is As I mentioned, we provide the basic levels of insurance and retirement funded by the USA Church. You notice those are basic levels. The life insurance we provide is not all the life insurance you're ever going to need. The disability insurance we provide through P&B funding is not all the disability insurance you're ever going to need. And the retirement funding that we provide is not all the retirement funding you're ever going to need. But what we do is set up the basics so that each employer and individual can build on that foundation for what they need. And then that building is done with the supplemental programs that we put together to assist the local church and the individuals in putting that unique package together. So the foundations are laid, and then each local employer builds on those with what is available through the office. And then the other thing we do, we try to answer the phone and respond to email, and we still get faxes. We still get letters that come in through the U.S. Postal Service. We try to be present and have been now for nearly 100 years. Why is that important? Well, we have discovered something over the years that may not be true on your district. But we have discovered that ministers tend to relocate from time to time. And sometimes they relocate across state lines. And when they do, they are entering into an environment of regulation that was not like where they were before. And benefits, especially insurance benefits, are regulated state by state by state. And what they may have been able to have had for coverage through their friendly local, maybe even board member insurance agent when they were in Pennsylvania, now isn't going to work in Ohio, and it's certainly not going to work in Kentucky, and nothing's going to work in New York. And so with this mobility that we see with clergy, one of the challenges that you can run into if you're not working through your denomination, and this is true across all denominations, if you're not working through your denomination, your mobility issue is sooner or later going to hamper you if you're moving across state lines. And so that's one of the things that we have found is helpful. So that's what we provide. Any more? Let's stop there. Any questions? Yeah.
Our life insurance, 15,000?
Yes.
5 when we retire?
Depends upon what your years of service were or what your benefit level is. But yeah, it's individual.
How would we know that? Where do we find that at?
Well, we can talk to you about that.
You can talk to me about that.
Yeah. And it's going to be different for each individual. Yes, sir.
When you say we need to work through the denomination for insurance, are you talking about medical insurance?
No, I'm talking about life and disability.
Okay, I was going to say,
Yeah.
because last time I heard, there was nothing
We don't do medical.
financially reasonable. I was going to say, I didn't think you even did it anymore.
We can't.
It's usually in the district, and it wasn't financially reasonable.
Yeah.
It was way out years ago.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move ahead. So what about the information piece? We do try to provide tax and compensation information. As I mentioned, we'll be working through some information on compensation structuring here in a little bit. The last point there probably is the most critical, and that is staying alert to changes. The tax laws changed. We've all heard that one, effective January 1 of 2018. And there were two things that are going to impact clergy. They impact everybody, but they will impact clergy in particular. Moving expenses. Are you all aware how the moving expenses changed under the new tax laws? If you haven't moved, it's probably not an issue. If you're going to move, it will be an issue. And the deductibility or employer payment to the tax-favored advantage that was there went away. And so you need to be aware of that. The other thing that happened, deductibility of unreimbursed business expenses expenses on Schedule A went away. So if you don't have a capital expense reimbursement plan, and you're planning on deducting your out-of-pocket business expenses for this year, impossible would be my first response. Difficult and risky would be my second response for any alternative that you look at to do that. But that went away. And so just those little things that, you know, well, we've done it this way for years. Guess what? We don't do it that way anymore. And so the tax laws have changed with regard to those two circumstances in particular. So you do need to stay up on the information. We try to do that and alert folks and put information out there, but it takes a while for all of that to filter through, and there's a lot of noise out there. But those are the two things to be aware of there. Health insurance. Let's talk about health insurance a little bit. It is entirely possible to go bankrupt in the United States due to out-of-pocket medical expenses. Entirely possible. In fact, highly probable. There was a Harvard study that was done a number of years ago. They have updated it since their original, but the numbers didn't change a whole lot. The number one cause of bankruptcies in the United States, 62% of bankruptcies in the United States, individual bankruptcy, is due to out-of-pocket, unreimbursed out-of-pocket medical expenses. Okay. The most challenging part about that is that 78% of those in that 62%, 78% of those folks had some form of health insurance. So health insurance isn't the same from policy to policy to policy. I think we know that, but what we find is that if you're paying a really, really low premium for health insurance, you may not be getting much coverage. And those are the risks that we run in the marketplace when we make those decisions and take those chances. And I would assume that every one of the folks that went bankrupt because of their out-of-pocket medical expenses in that 78% range and had health insurance, nearly all of them probably thought they were okay until they got sick, really sick. And then they realized they weren't okay. And so this is something that we're struggling with, not just in the Church of the Nazarene and not just in churches. This is an across-the-board challenge. And it's an issue. The Affordable Care Act addressed some of the problem, but it created a lot of confusion. And obviously, if you want to get a lot of political dialogue, dialogue would be a generous term for it, started, just talk about this. You know, just bring this one up at the Thanksgiving table and see what happens. We have partnered with Guidestone, which is the Southern Baptist Benefit Board, the Southern Baptist Benefit Arm, to assist congregations looking for coverage. They have agreed and have been doing so now for a number of years to offer to churches of the Nazarene the same health insurance that they offer to Southern Baptist congregations. And so through the Guidestone program, you could, over the years I've heard, why can't we have things as good as the Baptists have? Well, you can't, at least on health insurance. You can contact the Baptist and get Baptist health insurance. Now, the one thing, when they were making their initial proposal to us that I found very interesting, they did make a statement about the durability of their insurance. And they said, when it comes to having Southern Baptist health insurance, once insured, always insured. Think a minute. Yeah, there you go. Of course, the assumption is that you keep paying the premium. But they have stayed true to that. And we've talked to folks that have signed up for their insurance over the years, and their insurance plans changed, but whatever they had, they were able to keep as long as they paid the premium. So they've been pretty faithful in keeping that commitment. It's not cheap. It's health insurance. All right? The problem in our country isn't health insurance.
It's health premium.
It's the cost of health care. You know, and the aging population. That's what we're up against. And when you try to insure against our demographics with regard to health, that is not a risk most people want to take on, as evidenced by the premiums you have to pay. So that's kind of a challenge there. There is a qualified small employer health reimbursement account that has been established. It actually was set up effective January 1, 2017. It's referred to as a QSERA, and you may say, well, what in the world does that have to do with me? Well, in most cases, you're probably working for a small employer. Okay, most local churches or districts, most Nazarene entities other than a university would be a qualified small employer. And the old HRAs that have been around for a long time really addressed some of the issues that came into play. You know, when the Affordable Care Act came into play, the old process that we used to have of reimbursing out-of-pocket medical expenses for pastors on a tax-favored basis, just simply by setting up a program within the local employer, those all went away. Those got regulated out of existence because they were determined to be health plans. Anything that reimbursed medical expenses was a health plan. And health plans had to meet requirements. And one of the requirements was they had to, there would be no limit on what they would cover. In other words, unlimited coverage, and there's no lifetime cap. Well, those couldn't meet that requirement. No local church would take that on. I mean, no employer would take that on. And so those out-of-pocket medical expense reimbursement accounts went away with the Affordable Care Act. And all at once, everything that everybody had been doing for years was illegal. You know, we had been regulated into felony status in some cases. And the word didn't get out. People continued to do it. Fortunately, there wasn't a lot of enforcement behind it. But in fact, they really weren't supposed to be done. The Qualified Small Employer Health Reimbursement Account is a way to go back to doing that. Now, it does have to be through a formal HRA. Your employer has to qualify it. In most cases, every local church that I'm aware of, the Church of Nazarene, is going to qualify. But you should be using a third party to administer those for you. The good news is there are more third parties willing to administer those today than there were a year ago. And they do, because it's insurance, they do tend to be done regionally or locally. But you can set them up with a third party. Your local church pays into that account on your behalf, and then you work through that third party to have your out-of-pocket medical expenses reimbursed. And it's a tax-favored way to do that. So it might be a way to be aware of with regard to some of your out-of-pocket. I don't anticipate any solutions very soon to the health insurance issues in the USA. I don't see anything on the horizon that's very promising. There's a lot of heat and not a lot of light around the debate. And there's a lot of assumptions that are incorrect about who we are and how we take care of ourselves and how much it ought to cost. And there's, quite frankly, a lot of people making a lot of money off the current system. And those folks are not going to willingly and easily give up those sources of income. So it's going to be interesting to watch. And you're going to hear a lot, we're all going to hear a lot of stuff about health insurance. You know, the Medicare for all, that's the latest one, right? That's an interesting idea. Single payer health systems, those are interesting ideas, which basically is a version of Medicare for all. There's all kinds of stuff. But the one thing that isn't changing is, as a population, we're getting older, which means we're not getting healthier. And demand for medical services is going to continue to grow for the next 25 years, just because of our demographics. And when any commodity is in increasing demand, and there's a lot of people making a lot of money off of it, changing that system is not going to be easy. It's not going to be painless. So stay tuned. By the way, I failed to give you some information. And here's just one more point. Why don't we do our own? Individual mandate. Remember that term that's been out there, individual mandate with regard to health insurance? Church of the Nazarene polity does not support individual mandates. Okay? If the government can't do a health plan without an individual mandate, and quite frankly, long term, they can't, nobody can. And if you're trying to put together a group and you can't force into your risk pool a particular set of people on an ongoing basis through mandates, then you probably are not going to be able to run a health plan. And that's how come we couldn't run a health plan when we tried to run a health plan. And so that's kind of where that is. I forgot to give you some very important information. Let me come back to my first slide. All right. Right there is a web address. It's ppusa.org/East Ohio. I checked it on my phone this morning, and it works. If you'll put that in. Now, if it is HTTP, not HTTPS. If your autofill is HTTPS before the www, you're going to get an error message. But if you just go out to HTTP www, it'll come up. And all of the handouts, the slides that I'm doing here, and some additional information will come up. One of the things that will come up there is a pastor's compensation report. I'll talk about that a little later when we do the compensation. Well, it's an interesting document, and I think I probably shouldn't have told you about it because you're going to go read that and not pay attention to anything else I'd say. But we have been able to compile with research services some very interesting information on pastor's compensation for 2017 in the Church of the Nazarene, and we'll look at that. Let's move on through here. Any questions about health insurance? Anybody have any magic bullets that you'd like to suggest? Yes. You have a solution?
I have a question.
Okay.
The Q-Sarah, now, if I understood that, that's really only a question that might benefit a church that has more than one employee. If the pastor's the only employee, why go to Q-Sarah?
The Q-Sarah is, as long as you don't have more than 50 employees.
Okay.
Yeah, the Q-Sarah is simply there to reimburse otherwise out-of-pocket medical expenses.
But if you do a Q-Sarah, if you only have one employee,
You can do a Q-Sarah with one employee.
But what's the benefit? It's more paperwork. It's more trying to explain to the board.
Well, if you're right in terms of just the logistics, but in terms of the regulations, it's probably worth it because most plans that are set up that are just out-of-pocket medical expense reimbursement plans are not going to pass the one employer piece because they don't have unlimited benefits.
Okay, and that's this year or the coming year? Because the 2017 videos that Pension Benefits put out that we could watch and everything, they stepped through how a church with only one employee, the pastor, could get around the requirements. I've never heard anything for 2018 that was thrown out.
The one employer,
Yeah.
as long as it's a written plan and following that provision that was in there, you're probably going to be okay
For 2018.
for 2018. Yeah, probably would have been okay for 2017.
I think
But
that video came out in the beginning of 2017, so I just
Yeah.
heard what it said.
The 5 roads document that we produced with the ECFA took some of that into account. We didn't have, the rules actually were put into place on December 13th of 2016. And so by the time we had put that out, nobody really knew what the rules were going to be according to the 2017. We have a better idea now, but the QSERA really would be a better served for a church that had 2 or 3 employees. If you only have 1 employee, you're probably okay, but the safe harbor would still be the QSERA.
Well, the church treasurer liked what I presented, because when they wanted to hire a janitor, they said, you'll cut my benefits and I can no longer survive here. And she just niched that right there, and so we didn't, we don't, it saves the budget for,
Yeah.
when somebody's volunteer.
Yeah. We are in the process, well, I say we, ECFA is in the process of revising the 5 roads document. I believe that has been reposted. You might double check with what that is now saying.
What is that?
That it's the, at our website, there's a document entitled 5 roads for reimbursing medical expenses for employees. And if you just go to our website and in the search engine, don't write the word 5, just put in the letter 5, roads, and it'll come up. Yeah. But double check what the current one says, because I think they updated it through ECFA with regard to this issue. But the process of reimbursing directly probably works okay for the single employer, or for the single employee. But based upon what the rules say, it's a little risky. I would say that. All right, health insurance. Yeah.
Might be out of your arena, Don, but right now I'm writing on my wife's insurance plan. She's a teacher. Upon retirement for both of us, I'm looking at veteran benefits.
Veterans benefits. Honestly, if you can get them, you probably should go there. Good question. And even if you don't go the full route, if you have a veterans facility in the area that has a pharmacy, those of you that are veterans and you're taking prescription drugs, if there's a veterans pharmacy, anecdotally, what I've been hearing from pastors who are veterans is that that's a very good way to get prescription medications. It's kind of all over the place. All right, well, let's move ahead and talk about, let's see, let's come back here. So these are the basics that I mentioned that we provide out of the P&B fund. Life insurance, it's determined by your credential and by your P&B fund payment. We're in the process of reviewing that. Okay?
Is that for good or for bad? I'm going to ask.
Well, let me just talk about that. Okay? And maybe you need to talk to me about that. We do 3-year contracts with the insurance companies that we contract with. Okay? And we're in the process of renegotiating that contract right now. It's been with Aetna. Aetna's been purchased by Hartford, and so we're now working with Aetna/Hartford, and it will be Hartford going ahead if we stay with the current carrier. Okay. So first of all, starting with where we are with our benefit design, define the carrier, and then we're going to look at benefit design. I'm going to show you a slide here that I'm not meaning to be unkind, but quite frankly reflects the room. The single largest age category of active pastors in the Church of the Nazarene is 65 plus,
Well, I believe that.
okay? The second largest age category of active senior pastors in the Church of the Nazarene is 60 to 65. The third largest age category is 55 to 60, okay? About 60% of our active pastors are over 55 years of age. All right? Probably not a 20-year sustainable strategy. The average age of the district licensed pastors in the Church of the Nazarene in the United States, anyone want to guess what that, district licensed pastors? Anyone want to guess what that one is?
45.
43. Okay. Now, this, you probably encounter this on a regular basis. When I talk to district superintendents, this is not news to them. When I talk to pastors, it's not news to them. Unfortunately, as we get older, insurance, life insurance in particular, medical insurance, but life insurance in particular gets more expensive, especially term insurance, right? Which is what this is. When you have a large pool that you are insuring, and over half of them are over 55, guess what life insurance companies don't want to do?
All of them. Insurance.
Yeah, they don't want to give you life insurance, you know? I mean, they're looking at the risk.
Well, the highest mortality rate is 65. I used to sell insurance.
Yeah.
So when you got the biggest group at 65, that's going to be it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and so that's the challenge we're looking at. Now, would everybody like to have $50,000 of life insurance provided? Well, of course they would. I mean, you know, could we afford to pay for that? No, we can't afford that. We don't have the resources to do that. Now, one plan design that we're looking at is, you know, when you're giving everybody the same benefit, you're paying what we call a blended premium, which you would understand it takes into account the number of people that are 65 or 50 and older and the number of people that are 50 and younger, right? And so you get a blended premium. Guess what our demographic tends to blend us to?
The older.
Yeah, I mean, we're the very high premiums, right? And so we're looking at this and we're saying, well, if we are paying X number of dollars, what would that look like if, you know, we paid X number of dollars per person? What kind of coverage would somebody 30 get for that versus somebody 70 get for that? Okay? What's more fair? And I'm going to ask you the question because I don't know. All right? Talk to me. Given the fact that we need younger ministers, and given the fact that younger ministers are not in a position to have accumulated much in the way of assets, right? What would be more fair? If we're paying, I'll just throw out a number, let's say we're paying $150 a year for a premium, okay? We could buy $40,000, for instance, and I'm just throwing numbers here, I'm not giving you the exact quotes. We might be able to buy $40,000 of life insurance for somebody 30.
Which is close.
We may be able to buy $5,000 of life insurance for somebody who's 60.
And the idea is you don't need it when you're 30, you need it when you're 60. So one of the options they could look at.
Well, wait a minute, let's talk about that. Let's stop right there. What are the two reasons for which you buy insurance? Other than, you know, the two primary reasons. Now, insurance agents have a dozen, all right?
Betting you're gonna die.
Okay. One thing you want to make sure you're covered with is if you die, the final expenses are paid for, right? And roughly $10,000 to $15,000 funeral. Depends upon what form you want to go in the ground.
Cremation.
There you go. Isn't it funny how the cost, you know, as the cost of funerals goes up, our theology on cremation, anyway.
Hey, Tenacious days.
That's right, brother.
Okay, the other is to help assist with lost income for the survivors, right? I mean, life insurance is really lost income insurance in the event of death. Okay? That's what we're looking at here. $30,000 or $40,000 is not going to replace a lot of lost income. Over your working lifetime, and if you're in your 60s, hopefully you've been able to accumulate assets. And you're getting closer to the point where you would have been relying on something other than earned income anyway for your income, right? And so you're probably, as you get older, looking at more of a death benefit and less of an income replacement to with life insurance. When you're younger, you have not only a final expense issue to face, but also lost earned income to face, right? And so you've got the issue of, okay, if we have a young pastor that's deceased, we not only have a funeral to pay for, but we probably have a spouse and 2 or 3 kids, and $40,000 or $50,000 isn't going to replace all the lost earned income, but it certainly is going to help with their transition to new realities. Quite frankly, if I'm 65 or 70, it's final expenses, because I'm already looking at lost earned income due to age at that point, right? And so that's what we're looking at. What do you think about that kind of thinking?
Makes sense.
I'm sorry, somebody,
I
what?
said it makes sense.
Which in and of itself is never a criteria for anything, but it certainly is a guidestone. Yes, sir.
One of the things you could look at is whole life, especially for young people, because whole life is a dirt sheet. And then they can have the other investment in their term. And then as that goes, that same cost, like when I first started preaching 25 years ago, if they would have invested in me, even 15, it would have cost them $12, $15 a month.
How many churches have you pastored?
3.
Who owns the policy?
Well, the guy that dies owns the policy, you know that, you know the insurance law. You can't give the policy to the church.
No. And so as you go through that, ownership and who pays for it and all of that comes into play. It may be a solution, but maybe you're better off looking at putting those premiums into a 4-3. Yes, sir, you have it.
How does this apply to a small church like this with a part-time pastor and a couple of other part-time employees?
In terms of,
Well, in terms of really everything, health insurance, disability, retirement.
quite honestly, it's a challenge, okay? If you are not employing full-time employees, then you have to recognize that the total compensation that's being provided to those who serve you is shared with another employer, all right? And so one of the challenges, and yet I think it would be a helpful conversation, and the DS can correct me after I leave, they usually do, but we are approaching about 50% of our pastors being bivocational. There's 2 things that I think a bivocational pastor ought to talk to the church board about. First of all, when the pastor who is bivocational gives his or her monthly report to the board, they shouldn't just report on what they've done as a pastor in pastoral work. They should also be reporting what they have done in their other employment, so that that local church understands what that individual is doing, so that that church can have a pastor. Okay? Isn't that fair? So when you ask, Pastor, what did you do with your time? He or she can say, well, I spent 35 hours as a pastor, and I spent 40 hours on this employment so that you could have a 35-hour pastor. I think that's an appropriate conversation. The flip side of that is when they're putting together the compensation, if the pastor is receiving benefits of whatever kind from the other employment, then whatever benefits are provided through the church employment should coordinate and complement with that. I mean, from an economic efficiency standpoint, that should be a conversation. You now are talking about things that people probably don't want to talk about. But in order for the dollars to be spent appropriately, it's probably appropriate. Yes?
I think one of the other disadvantages that people don't really recognize as a disadvantage is a parsonage. That when a pastor, like myself, who's always lived in a parsonage that's purchased by the home, by the church family,
Right.
we retire and we have zero equity, at least
Right.
in any tangible form. And so, John Lane's been come up with this really great plan about a church, talking to a church about building asset or building equity
Mhm.
as part of their salary benefits. But I don't know if we are going to eventually speak is that if that's coming up in compensation. That's what we're wrestling with now. Is how do we who are getting closer to retirement who have been in parsonage this much time? What are our options?
First and foremost, if we're not talking about it, it's never going to be addressed, right?
Sure.
And so we need to begin to have uncomfortable conversations around one of the greatest taboo topics in the church, which is still money. All right? And in particular, the conversation between the local church board or the finance committee and the pastor. And we need to be honest with each other about what our risks are. You know, it's back to these risks. What if I live too long? If I'm in a parsonage, that's a piece of talking about that risk, right? And we have recommended, and you know, again, there's a lot of noise out there, but we have recommended for a number of years, and we have one of our little church memos. I believe it's actually church memo number 1, housing allowance versus parsonage, and it just walks through the pros and cons of each one. But one of the cons of having a parsonage is the lost equity. And in fact, one of the recommendations that we have been making in that pros and cons document has been, if you're going to have a parsonage, then the local church should recognize the lost equity and be making additional contributions to the 403B account to recognize each year, not at the end of, if you wait until the end of somebody's pastorate, no, that's too late to have the conversation. Now, but it might be surprising that within 5 years of retirement, it's still a great conversation. It's okay to have that conversation. And to begin to talk about, yes, a parsonage is a wonderful benefit, and here are all the pros, but here are the cons, and how can we address those? What strategies can we have in place? And, you know, if you set something up that just simply says, well, we'll just look at whatever the equity growth was in the parsonage in any given year, and we'll put those dollars into a 403B account, that may or may not work, because property values tend to do this, and so that may or may not work, but you could look at rolling averages, or you could look at some kind of a standard policy that says we recognize lost equity by not having home ownership and wish to address it through this strategy. But just ignoring it and not talking about it is never going to address the issue. So it's an appropriate conversation to have.
You know, though, you're talking about the benefit package, and here's the problem. The church tithes are going down and down and down and down, and the church is burdened with a lot of things. And so that puts a burden upon the church in general for those things.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, let's face it, you look at church in general, the numbers are going down in general. Now, there's some areas that aren't, because I've checked a lot of different things out. And it, you know, it really burdens the church to say that, you know, we need to add more for this, you know. And I feel myself that what you need to do is, if you're living in a parsonage, now thank God my house is paid for, you know what I'm saying? I have my own home and it's paid for, but I had to work through that also to get it paid for. But if you have those extra funds, and this is hard because, you know, we're held a lot of times down to a basic minimum. If we have those extra funds, we need to put them in the P&B so that we have some retirement there in order to buy something or something when we go to retire. And it's a hard thing because, you know, in my household, every dollar, we know where every dollar is going.
Yep.
You know, with what I get from the church and what I get with making school bus driving. So we know, and you know, it puts a burden on a lot of things, the way things are taking place in the United States and all the things that the government is doing and trying to do what they can to have their finger, you know, down on us like an ant. So, and it's a tough thing when you live in a parsonage and you say,
It is, yeah.
what about us, you know?
Now, one interesting thing about the parsonage versus housing allowance, and we're wandering around here, is that okay? I mean, we're off topic. But we're on what you want to talk about, so is that okay? All right. The housing allowance litigation that's out there right now. And it was argued in the appeals court yesterday. I got an interesting email last night from one of the attorneys that was there listening in, and quite honestly, I was somewhat encouraged just by the report of the oral argument. So for what it's worth, that's, you know. But what happened early on in that litigation was, and the Freedom from Religion Foundation filed a lawsuit claiming that ministers' housing allowance is unconstitutional. Okay, so when the court began to hear that, they looked at that and they said, well, we're going to separate out and create two classes of ministers. We are not going to address the constitutionality of whether or not a parsonage should be taxed, the value of parsonage. We're going to set that aside. We're only going to look at the cash housing. Well, you know what that did? I mean, that just created a mess, no matter what they decide, right? And so, we're always subject to just the whims of whatever may be happening in the culture with regard to this, right? So, we're always looking at the pros and cons based upon whatever the current rules might be, and they change on us. But one of the things that is stable is if I'm putting a little bit away over time,
Right.
it does make a difference.
Right.
Yeah. But the housing allowance issue and the parsonage and the forfeited equity, those are all things that ministers have to deal with. And honestly, it's not just the aging baby boomers that's driving the demographics in terms of the age categories of our pastoral staff, of our pastoral cohort. It's retirement readiness too. And so that's, I mean, it has to be stuff we're talking about. And there are no easy overnight quick solutions. Can I tell you that? Is that understandable? There are no easy overnight quick solutions. Yeah.
Do we know when we're going to know for sure whether we're going to be allowed to keep our cash housing allowance? Because I know exactly what you guys said 3 years ago, because I'm in my 50s.
Yeah.
I purchased a home and I'm making payments on it now. So to me, it's really a hot topic.
Oh, it's a huge topic to literally hundreds of thousands of congregations across the U.S. This is not just a Nazarene thing. This is huge. Interestingly, the particular court I've been led to believe that is hearing this argument tends to be a little slow in writing their opinions. I don't know if that's because one of the judges on the 3-judge panel is 92 years old, but
You don't have no retirement either.
no, he doesn't have any retirement either. He took that lifetime appointment seriously. But they tend to be a little slow in issuing opinions, so we may not have an opinion out of that particular court until January or February. Whoever loses is going to appeal. The next court is the Supreme Court. We then will have to hear whether or not the Supreme Court's going to take the case. Whatever so we have no idea. But it's coming down to the end, and in about 24 months, we should have a pretty good idea.
That's a good enough answer. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well.
Which court?
I'm sorry.
Which court was it? What number?
Chicago, 7, I think. Yeah, it wasn't 9. It was 7. So, retirement contributions, we do need to have your local congregation have a participation agreement on file with us in order for dollars to go into your account. I think we're all aware of that. That's not the issue that it used to be, and I think most churches on this district have done that. And then, of course, there's the, so what do you do with the P&B fund, and how do you qualify for the money that comes out of P&B? The first line here, pretty easy to understand that one. If you pay zero into the P&B fund, it's not very difficult to calculate where your benefits are going to be. They will be zero. We have about 20% of our congregations each year that pay zero in the P&B fund. Okay. Let me just say, zero payment is not a financial issue. Can I be that bold? The inability to pay in full, that's a financial issue. And we get that. We understand that. Zero payment is an engagement issue.
Yeah.
Okay? And so, and I'm not just talking P&B. I'm talking whatever the obligation might be, whether it's district or education or World Evangelism Fund, whatever it is. Zero payment is an engagement problem. That's how come when we start offering benefits at $1 of payment, can we buy $15,000 worth of life insurance and a $400 monthly disability benefit for $1? No. It's not about the dollar. It's about the engagement. And once a church is able to understand how this works and be engaged in the process, the benefits then can be paid. $1 to 49% of the P&B fund goal is the life and disability insurance, because those tend to be the more immediate needs. 50% to 99% of the goal, we then will put $200 into the account. Is anybody going to be able to retire on that? No. But it's better than nothing, which is pretty much what most folks in the USA have in their retirement. I'm not talking about in the Church of the Nazarene, I'm talking about in the USA, have saved in retirement. 100% of the P&B fund goal, then there's a bonus amount of 10% of what P&B fund amount was paid that goes in. And then 100% of the P&B fund plus the education fund, there's a 50% match on whatever you and or your local church would put away up to $250. And so the more that's paid, the more benefits there are to accrue from the P&B fund. Yes, sir?
So, 100% of P&B plus whatever that church is obligated for education.
Yeah.
Why,
So that's-
why is that?
Excellent question. Thank you. Thank you for asking. Yeah, the education connection was put in place. We're looking at it again. And we study it every year to see, how many people were hurt by it, quote unquote. The education piece was put in place back when the quote unquote budget formula changed. The education piece used to be 2.5% and P&B was 2%. We, because of, and not just we, but a lot of pension plans, because of the downturn in 2008, suffered some real decline in asset values. And we weren't going to be able to invest our way out of it. And so the budget formula was changed. So the colleges took 1/4% less and P&B got 1/4% more. And at that point, we recognized, and by saying we, it wasn't just us, it was the Board of Pensions and the Pensions Office, but also the church leadership that was very sensitive about the education issue, recognized that we didn't want to take this action and give any incentive for less payment of the education fund. Because in any given year, since this has gone into place, since the education and P&B have been equal, in any given year, the amount of money that is forfeited by the regional college because of that formula change is greater than what is paid in by any district on the region. And so, I mean, what the colleges have done to help the minister's pension and to give us assets that enable us to continue to provide some basic benefits, it has translated into about $12 million. And so the idea was, at least for the matching part, now it doesn't apply to any of the others, but at least for the matching money that we're going to be spending, let's make sure that we're putting some incentive in there to recognize the colleges and what they're doing to help out the whole system of ministers' funding. That's why it's there.
I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
I would think that if we want to reflect our DNA, it would be NMI, world language.
Well, could well be. This was just simply in recognition of something the colleges have done for PNB. It was a direct connection. So, yeah.
Clarify, I'm pretty sure that $250, up to $250 matching contributions, that is annual, that's not monthly.
That's annual. Right. Yeah, that's your annual.
Because that makes a difference as to what somebody, if they were employed before becoming a minister, what
Yeah.
they might do with their investment. If it's only $250 a year, I mean, it's nice, but it might be best to keep what we already have locked in for our investments instead of pulling them out and doing that. If it's $250 a month, I'd say I'm pulling.
Yeah. No, that's just an incentive on behavior.
Which is good, you just have to plan your own personal financial.
Yeah. You have to be putting some additional money away. Yeah.
Do you have a slide on there, like, let's say somebody says, well, I get Social Security, got a fair idea what you're going to get, I want $400, $500 a month, how much do I need to have in there to have a return to meet that amount? You got something like that?
Actually, I don't know that there's a slide, but the current rule of thumb is 4%, a 4% drawdown annually.
So if you get $500,000, if you want $200 with a 4% drawdown, you have to have 500,000. So, yeah.
Yeah, whatever the math works out to.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 4% drawdown is what's going now. It used to be 5%. The longer you wait to take it, the higher the percentage can be. So the 4% assumes a 65 start. If you wait until age 70, that 5% is not at all unreasonable. And the idea is just making sure you don't outlive the assets. And that's 4% of the balance at the beginning of the year.
Which changes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, personal participation is critical. It's never too late, never too little. That's one of the challenges that we often run into when we talk to people. Well, you know, I'm 50 years old, it's too late for me to do anything because all the illustrations show starting out at 25 and I can't turn the clock back, so I'll just not do anything. And that's unfortunate because really doing something at any point can make a difference in the future. So that's just a little bit of an illustration there. I have a problem with some of the retirement planning calculators that are out there, even the ones that we use, because you'll go out there and they ask you questions about what do you want to have in retirement, right?
That's right.
And so you put information in there. And then they reflect back to you and they tell you, well, in order for you to have what you say you want, you need to be saving, and they'll give you a number. It's absolutely impossible to save, right? That's what nearly all of them will do. In fact, I don't know of any that don't do it that way. And there's something in the human psyche that looks at that and says, if I can't do 500, then I'll do 0. Right? I mean, that is the behavioral response. When the recommended behavior is so overwhelming, the human response is, well, it's impossible. I can't do anything, so I won't. When in fact, a logical response might be, well, I can't do 500, but I could do 50. And the 50 may not look like much, but it is amazing what it would do over time into retirement, right? And the best retirement calculators out there don't let you really put a good value on even minimum amounts. So that's kind of for what it's worth there. And here's a little study we did with current behaviors with regard to Nazarene pastors saving for retirement. The news is that 74% of pastors are at risk of needing to retire past the age of 72. I don't think that's news to anybody, but there's the number. And then here's the chart I was talking about earlier. That's our demographic. That's the ages of Nazarene, active Nazarene pastors in the Church of Nazarene today.
So the actual pastors that are preaching are the largest groups over 65 years old?
Yeah. So what about putting money away? Well, when we designed the plan, we've kind of gone here, and I'll finish this up and stop, and then we'll see where, is that okay? I wander around. I never really know when I'm looking at glazed faces whether it's the topic or the time, but I'm going to assume at this point it's the time. So when we put the plan together, we tried to put it in place so that it would be as beneficial as possible. When you put $1 away into the Nazarene 403B plan, obviously there's no taxes, income taxes, but oftentimes we don't always recognize the value. There's also no self-employment tax. And between the no income tax and the no self-employment tax, that leverages your initial year's contribution by about 30%. So that's kind of a nice thing to have. And then there is a form, 8880, that in fact will let you have a refundable tax credit against a portion of your personal contributions to the plan if you fit in certain income categories. And the income categories that are there usually allow most ministers to fit, because housing or housing allowance is not included in calculating the income levels on that form. And coupled with the housing benefit and the historically low compensation that most clergy earn anyway, it's not hard to qualify for a little bit of a tax credit. You've already saved the income taxes, you've already put the money away, and now because of this Form 8880, which is the Saver's Credit, it's credit for qualified retirement savings contributions, you could actually take a credit for some of your contributions against your final tax liability. That's the closest the government's going to come to matching your contributions to a retirement plan. So if you're filing your taxes, most automated filing systems will pull this up, but they may not. So at least be aware of the benefit there. So we talked about the pocket pain relief on the 403B contributions, and that basically, if you're able to take advantage of all three of those areas of help, your $1 of contribution to the retirement account may only actually result in pocket pain of maybe 60 or 70 cents. So that's a benefit that you want to be aware of. There is currently in place, I hope all of you are aware of the Compass Initiative, and we just put that in there. There is a Lilly grant, or a grant from the Lilly Foundation, that has been given to the Church of the Nazarene. It's being operated through clergy development, clergy services, and if you're interested, it is there. It's a $2,500 grant, and it's to assist with debt relief, especially student debt relief, and retirement readiness. So if you're interested in that program and those grants, I would suggest that you contact the Compass Initiative.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because and it could be that I'm ignorant, and that's totally fine. If you tell me that, I'm not kidding.
Well, I am too. You're looking at everything I know, so.
Okay, because I have a lot of student loan debt.
Yeah.
I'm still going to school because I'm an idiot, but anyway. And so I'm looking at that, and
one of the things that was confusing to me is it looked like to match the matching grant portion, your church is asked to raise the portion, and whatever they raise, then that's what they match.
That's my understanding. That's one part of the program. There's another part of the program that they have introduced that they're calling Quest, kind of a Compass Light.
Okay.
It's a little less of a grant, but it's not quite the hoops to jump through.
Okay.
So, and then I now have told you probably even more than I know.
Okay.
But that's kind of basically where it is.
Okay.
One of the challenges, as I've engaged with them and talked with them about, and attended a couple of sessions of the Little League folks with other denominations, apparently giving money away is one of the hardest things you can do. Especially when you put some of the caveats on it that are attached to the grant issues. And you've touched on the point, right? So, yeah, there's money there. Yes, it is grant money. Yeah, there are hoops to jump through. Just be aware there are hoops.
Not my daughter.
I'm sorry?
Your money where you really need it, my daughter.
I'll just come.
Yes. There you go. This gentleman would like to be a doctor. All right. So when we looked at designing the plan, what are the barriers to getting people to save for retirement? So we went through and looked at the list. So what does it take to get people to save for retirement? And this isn't just Nazarene ministers. This is everybody. What are the barriers? If you're going to put together a plan, what are the barriers to get people to save? Well, the first one is opening the account. I mean, honestly, opening an account is a big step. It takes time. You have to engage in a process. You have to answer questions. So that's an issue. Making the initial contribution. You saw how many churches are zero pay? That just getting over the idea of saving on a regular basis and doing something, just making the initial contribution and committing to doing the contribution is a big step. So that's another barrier. Meeting minimum contribution requirements. Nearly every retirement plan has some kind of a threshold that you have to meet in order to participate. Salary percentage, dollar amount, frequency of contribution. So that's a barrier. Selecting an investment. That tends to, if people make it through to that point and then they look at the investment choices, they abandon, they drop out of enrollment at that point. Selecting a beneficiary. Believe it or not, that's a challenge for some folks. And then finally, making personal contributions on a regular basis over time, which is kind of an addition to that initial contribution thing. It's the further commitment issue. So we looked at those and we said, how many of those barriers, if we were to design a plan, how many of the barriers could we just do away with in order to have a plan that would get people going and at least get momentum? And so, in the Nazarene 403B Retirement Savings Plan, we will open the account for you. At the point where you have your first qualifying ministerial assignment and at least an ordination or district license credential, we will open the account. And then if your local church participates in paying at least half the P&D fund, we'll put money into the account. A lot of money? No. But at $200, it tends to be more money than about 60% of the people who are in the plan are putting away. That's about all that's happening. We have about 40% of folks that are participating and about 60% that are relying on $200 a year. That's not going to work. But anyway, we will at least make that initial contribution. We have waived minimum requirements in this plan. There is no minimum dollar amount, there is no minimum salary percentage, and there is no minimum frequency required to put money away in the Nazarene 403B Retirement Savings Plan. If all you can do is $25 a quarter, do $25 a quarter. It's not, initially, it's not about the dollar amount. It's about the threshold of behavior. Okay? If you don't want to select an investment, we will select an investment. It's a target date fund based on when you will be age 65. And fortunately, on the day you were born, we were able to calculate that. So, we'll do that. And if you don't select your beneficiary, we will select one for you. If you're married, it will be your spouse. Okay? We're not bright, but we are that bright. And if you choose to have somebody other than your spouse as the beneficiary, we will have your spouse sign that form. And, for obvious reasons. We don't want to be part of surprises, especially those kind of surprises. So we will have your spouse sign that form. Then, number 6, we can't make personal contributions for you. We've addressed 5 of the 6, but we can't do number 6. We've tried to make it as easy as possible, but we can't reach into your pocket and take money out and put it away for retirement for you. That's where you have to participate. But again, start small and do something. It's amazing what little things done over time will do. Can I share a little bit about the conversation you and I had? I'm not going to talk dollars or anything. I'm going to talk behaviors. John? We had a conversation with Rick. He was talking to me about somebody, a family, to whom he has been ministering since 1978. A member of that family has been very fortunate in terms of their finances and would like to bless him in retirement. Okay? 1978. Little things done consistently over time. All right? Never underestimate the impact of little things done consistently over time. Whether it was a call to minister to people that you did consistently over time, that now yields a financial result. Not why you ministered, not why you made the investment in people, but it was done consistently over time. I happen to believe in the church world, and the stories that I hear like this, if we are faithful, both financially and in everything else God calls us to, all right? I believe this. If we are faithful to be obedient in little things consistently over time, we have a right to rest and to be at peace. Because all of the promises of God are ours. If we're faithful in little things consistently over time. It works in retirement savings, but it works in everything you do every day when you interact on behalf of Christ and His church in your community. For what it's worth. Okay? And that's how come we have set this plan up like this. Because we believe that principle needs to be at work. Now, that's not how it's done in most plans. Most plans have minimum thresholds in terms of dollar amounts and percentages of salary. That defeats the whole point of why we exist. So, for now, this is who we are and how we operate. Can somebody help us? Well, I don't know. We can talk to you. We used to talk about having question and answer sessions. I gave up on that a long time ago. We have questions and discussion sessions. And so we may or may not be able to answer anything, but we certainly will try to talk to you and provide guidance and help. There's your P&B connection and the Fidelity connection. And understand, one of the best things you need to understand in all of this working over time is you're not alone. First and foremost, of course, is the promise that God gave to Moses. My presence will be with you. I will give you rest. What a wonderful promise. Now, P&B can't give you the same promise, but we can tell you that we exist as an expression of care and concern on behalf of the Church of the Nazarene for those serving in local congregations and districts. Barbara there. That's That's what all the money is for. That's why we do what we do. And we can only exist because you, the church, have called this P&B thing into existence. And we understand that and take it seriously. So there we are on that. Questions about contact or some of that final stuff? Brother Williams, let's bring up that other slide 6. Move through that. So let's talk about pastoral compensation a little bit. Let's talk about the mechanics of how. But honestly, the mechanics of how need to be preceded with some of the discussion about why. Is that fair? Why do we pay the pastor? What is it about our mission that has us giving money to people to minister? And there is an interesting tension on church boards. It's always been there. I think it's more so today. And you mentioned it and you explained it beautifully. All right?
I did something right.
No, and as you were talking about that, that is where every local church is today. What we want to do for the pastor, the resources available to do ministry, period. And it's not getting less expensive to build a building. It's not getting less expensive for utilities and maintenance. Those expenses are going up. If you look at the pastor's compensation report form that's out there at the website, what we have discovered is an increasing percentage of local church dollars going for personnel. Probably 30 to 40 years, 30 years ago, roughly, we would have been looking at a relatively evenly divided pie chart of the 3 P's for local church expense.
30.
Roughly, yeah, roughly. It would have been about equal parts for personnel, property, and program. I mean, it wasn't at all, that was kind of typical. If you look at the numbers right now, and honestly, the Mount Vernon region is the best in terms of the balance that's there. We are approaching 42% of local church expenses going for personnel costs. And the larger the church, the higher the percentage number. Which comes into play against that bivocational versus single vocational conversation. And when we started working with research to kind of reissue this pastor's compensation report, for decades we did a pastor's compensation report, and then they quit collecting the data. And so we couldn't do the report anymore. And so we had a hiatus of about 4 or 5 years in there where we didn't do a report. So they started collecting the information again on that supplemental report that you fill out for the pastor's annual report form. We started collecting some more data on compensation. And we don't do that so we can find out what your compensation is. And I say we, I'm talking about the data collect, the people that like to look at data. We're not really concerned about what any one church does. That's not the issue. The issue is what's happening across all the churches. How does regional difference come into play here? And then the one thing that we really were able to do now that we didn't used to be able to do was to look at, on a self-reported basis, the single vocation versus the bivocational pastor. Because that's a big deal. And we need to see what's happening with that trend. And that's going to be a big deal on how we structure the work of pensions and benefits. How do we design benefit plans that take into account these two models and the differences between them and not get out of sync one way or the other, because that would be easy to do if we just kept doing things the same way and didn't recognize this change. So we're looking at that. But when you're looking at moving from roughly 30 to 33% a couple of 3 decades ago for compensation, and now moving up to the mid-40s, and honestly, some larger churches, it's in the 50s.
Wow.
Okay? And those tend to be, obviously, churches that spend a lot of money for buildings as well. The piece of the pie called programming, and then that can, whatever we do that's not personnel and property, it's everything else. That is the piece that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Which says something about where we're headed. Now, I'm just the pension guy. I don't know what it says, but I think it says something. And I think the fiduciary obligation of every local church that it has to balance, which is the church board has to make sure we have a viable entity here called the church, but we also have a stewardship responsibility of taking care of the pastor God has given us. That is becoming an increasingly difficult tension to navigate. It's not a creative tension, it's an uncomfortable tension.
By vocation, what percentage are they at? Any idea?
It's lower. It tends to be 30, but it's in the high 30s.
Is it still that high?
Yeah, yeah. And it's different by region, and the data's out there. After I've looked at 3 pie graphs and 2 bar charts, I forget everything. So my memory is a count on that stuff. But look at that report. We put national averages in there for each region so that you can kind of see what the national averages look like across the board. But then we broke it down by single vocational, bivocational, and the region. It's by church size, basically in terms of dollars raised, because this is a dollar chart, and so that's kind of the thing we're looking at. But we're seeing it was interesting to see the change that happened during the hiatus.
Is there a chart there? And where would I find it also about attendance and growth versus by vocation and full-time?
We didn't do that one. Now,
I think that'd be very interesting.
I'm not saying research doesn't have that data. I think the research department has that data. We didn't put that in this report. This is just a pastor's compensation report. But it gives local congregations some idea, and districts some idea of, so what is everybody else doing? Because I think sometimes we feel like we're operating in a vacuum here. And we need some benchmarks to look at. So hopefully that'll be helpful. So anyway.
I'd like to share something with you.
Yeah.
I'm bivocational, okay? And I have a very small church.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what I've noticed is, I've noticed that I have taken a personal sacrifice. I've made a personal sacrifice, and I fund those programs. I'm going to tell you, we fund those programs in our church. I'll tell you why. Because I have seen blessing after blessing after blessing after blessing of God taking care of Karen and I, and taking care of all our needs as we continue to pay those programs.
Mm-hmm.
Because those programs are out there for a reason. Our missionaries are out there for a reason. And when we fund those people, God blesses us. It's that simple. And I'm not telling you it's financially all the time, because it was so funny. I'll give you an example. 6 months ago, a lady on the board said, Pastor, we want to go ahead and give you a raise. We think we can do it. $20 a week. And I said, well, that's great, but I don't think we can afford it. Okay, I don't think we can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
She said, but we want to try it. So the treasurer come back 6 months later and says, Greg can't do it. I said, that's fine. But you know what happened? The church got blessed through something else. Because it's sometimes a sacrificial giving that we do up. And it's not all about money. It's about our heart and what God wants out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we continue to fund those programs no matter what, because you know what? God has blessed that little church through it over and over and over and over again. And I don't want to pat on the back or anything. It's what I'm there for. I'm there to be their leader and show them this is how God operates.
Yeah. It's about cultivating a culture of generosity.
Yes. Yes.
And not all generosity is measured with dollar signs.
Amen.
Right?
That's right.
Is that okay?
Amen.
And if we can begin to cultivate a culture of generosity among our people, it will begin to translate
Amen.
into dollar signs.
Yes.
And there are some folks who need to be encouraged about the generosity of spirit that they have expressed to bridge that over to the dollar
Amen.
sign.
That's right.
Okay? Sometimes the folks who are not as generous with their giving are some of the most generous people in the church, and they haven't made the link yet. And sometimes we have to know them well enough to get them over that bridge, right?
Yes, that's right.
But that's part of the pastoral mission. That's part of spiritual formation. That's part of helping them become generous in all areas of life.
Amen.
And if we can see the seed of generosity in one area of life, it then can be cultivated to move out into other areas. So these tensions that we're seeing here, they're not unique, again, to the Church of the Nazarene. They're not unique even to not-for-profits. But we are all dealing with tensions of keeping the organization viable and also properly maintaining those whom God has given to us to serve us. So recognizing that, then, we want to be efficient in what we do with regard to compensation. Just some ground rules. The cost of having a pastoral ministry includes two parts. I think we all recognize this. The tax law changes have really reinforced it. The cost of what is done in having a pastoral ministry. And that is a local church operating business expense. And it should be paid for by the local church as an operating business expense. We're talking about an accountable expense reimbursement plan here. And then the compensation for who does it, the personnel cost. And there's reference there to a memo number 4, which is guidance in setting up the pastoral compensation package. We also have at our website a compensation calculator. It has been set up for the purpose of helping a local church walk through the compensation package and yielding a document that, if you care to, both the church board and the pastor can sign as an agreement with regard to compensation. And then the pastor's compensation report is being posted there too, so that local churches can see, based upon where they are and what they pay, where do they fit with other churches of similar profile. And so those are tools that are out there. But we need to recognize that just because $1 is given to a pastor, that's not compensation. We in this room know that. But oftentimes local churches don't understand that. So that's part of the educational process that we have with local churches as employers to understand just because you give a pastor $1 doesn't mean he or she is getting paid a salary if it's reimbursing their out-of-pocket expenses to do work that you've asked them to do. And so that's a very critical principle in all of this. And so that's one of the ground rules that we talk about. Again, ministers have unique tax status. And each year we produce the tax guide, and then there's memo number 12 that kind of walks through in the Church of the Nazarene who was a minister for tax purposes and who would be considered a lay employee. For income tax purposes, obviously, ministers should be getting a Form W-2. I think we're all aware of that. But they file their self-employment, their Social Security taxes as if they're self-employed. One of the most convoluted, confusing parts of the tax law in the United States for ministers and churches to navigate. It's a very difficult thing. And if you get it mixed up and messed up in the reporting, it can be very, very difficult to unwind. As if we didn't have enough to do, working through a problem like that can really be a challenge. And so just making sure we have those ground rules understood. And the local church employer must remain engaged in the process. One of the biggest challenges we have P&B and talking to local church lay leaders, and we get calls from church treasurers and board members a lot, especially around tax time, is really helping them understand that as an employer, they have to stay engaged in the process. That if they just simply want to make it easy for themselves and give the pastor a check, and then leave it up to the pastor to decide what to do with that money, well, that's easy for the church treasurer. That's very expensive for the pastor. Especially now with the tax law changes. It becomes a very expensive thing for the pastor. So getting the church to remain engaged as an employer is a challenge. And so one of the things we talk about when setting up a pastoral compensation is first and foremost from a tax perspective. Now this is the context of taxes, okay? Other issues may come into play, but let's talk about the context of taxes. First and foremost, you need to set up an expense reimbursement plan. Then we move around the chart to where finally it's the salary that we talk about. And oftentimes when we go in and talk to a local church board, they want to talk about salary and then whatever they can afford to do. And that's a very inefficient way to do it from a tax perspective. It may be that you can't afford to pay a salary. And oftentimes, as we've worked with treasurers and talked to them about, well, you reimburse the expenses, and then you look at tax-favored benefits, fully tax-favored, and then you look at partially tax-favored. You kind of walk them through that, and then they say at the end of the process, we won't be able to afford to pay a salary. Guess what? You already are not able to afford to pay a salary. Because the pastor now has to be responsible for all of that stuff anyway. And this isn't about what looks good on the church's report to the district. We're talking about what's the most efficient, what's the best stewardship of the dollars that you have to spend for personnel. And so, first and foremost, set up that accountable expense reimbursement plan. And understand that that is not compensation. Now, I'm preaching to the choir. This is the easiest part of the day right here, because I'm preaching to the choir, right? But everybody knows that, except until you get a new treasurer. And I didn't pastor long, but I pastored long enough to know you do want your church treasurer to be your best friend. Not a relationship you want going south. And those can be difficult conversations, and so you get a new treasurer. What do? Well, we do have some tools that will help them understand their reporting requirements as an employer. And those are updated every year. They're free for you to download and print and give to the new treasurer. But it's a most of them don't get paid anything. It takes a lot of time. It's work that not everybody wants to do.
That's right.
We're asking somebody to do hard work for no pay, and then we want them to do it according to rules that don't make sense.
That's right.
Why wouldn't anybody just want to volunteer for this job?
Amen.
Right? And so we have this challenge. We understand that. We try to provide some tools, and honestly, let me tell you something. If you are in a situation where you feel like you are about to have a really uncomfortable conversation with your church treasurer about your compensation, don't go there. Honestly, have them call the Pensions and Benefits office. There's no need for you to have them upset with you. It's okay for them to be upset with us. All right? We'll go home at night and forget their name. You can't go home at night and forget their name. So it's okay. That's why I'm serious, though. If you're going to have an uncomfortable conversation with the church treasurer about an accountable expense reimbursement plan, don't. Call us. Have them call us. And we'll talk them through it. We'll provide them the documents. We'll give them what they need in order to do their job with regard to this particular tax. So we want to set that up. So the expense reimbursements, there's a little document there. Accountability is a big issue. The local church deserves to have you tell them how you spent the money. But by the same token, once you've done that, when they reimburse your expenses, it doesn't go anywhere on the Form W-2, and therefore you get the full tax advantage because you don't have to try to deduct it anywhere, and oh, by the way, you can't anymore. So it makes life a whole lot easier. And then kind of the caveats there. If you set up an accountable expense reimbursement plan, and if there is written into that plan a statement that says it will be our policy to give to the pastor any unused portion as compensation, take that out of there. Just don't have that in there. There may be other ways to address that, but don't make it part of your own policy. It should be. Okay. And then try to reclassify funds after payment. That, here, pastor is $200, and you tell us how you spend it, and then that's how we'll put it on the Form W-2. Don't do that, because once they hand you the dollar and it's your discretion, it's your constructive receipt at that point. If it's your discretion on how to spend it, it's box 1 W-2 income. Okay, so just understand that. So those are kind of the things about the reimbursements. Yeah.
Well, Memo 11, is there a form or something that pastors can use, you know, to do the 5 Ws and everything? Or do we
I don't think
find
the
out?
I don't think the form is there, but quite honestly, it's a pretty, you know, each treasurer kind of does their own thing or wants something. And I would say that when you fill out your expense report and give it to the treasurer, as long as you're making sure you know, what you spend, where you spend it, and the date, how much, and the ministry purpose. The ministry purpose addresses the big issue that most accountability doesn't come into play. But there's ministry purpose in what we do. And in fact, you know, the likelihood of a church getting audited is somewhere near zero. And if you're getting mail that is trying to scare you into using somebody's services because you're going to get audited by the IRS, probably not. The chances of you personally as a minister getting audited are much, much higher. But by the same token, if in doing the audit on you, they decide they want to look at the church, that's when you want the church records to be up to date. So that's kind of where it is. But if you have good records that are maintained on a contemporaneous basis, and you've shown that you've complied with this in good faith, shouldn't be an issue. Okay. All right, so we want to get our expenses reimbursed. At this point, there are a lot of churches that have no money left over for benefits and compensation, right? I mean, when I look at the bivocational pastor percentages, I'm guessing that if every bivocational pastor were getting his or her expenses reimbursed 100%, we would be reporting even less compensation for bivocational pastors. I wouldn't be surprised when a lot of bivocational pastoral compensation that's reported really should have been expense reimbursement and the salary should have been zero. And that's a pride factor that no church wants to put out there, but it's reality. So, you know, that's, yeah.
There's only one problem with that. One of my pastor friends, as he retired, he did that, but his Social Security was almost nil.
Well,
And that's what you have to factor into that, so that's something to watch very carefully.
it's probably easier to save your own money in an account than to try to get your Social Security benefit pumped up. But, I mean, that would be my response to it. I would say initially, don't pay any income taxes.
Yeah, but to get $1,200 a month, you would have to have $2 million saved. You don't make money to save $2 million, it just won't work.
Well,
And that's something you gotta be careful, gotta really be careful. And my accountant that I use led me a long time ago, don't do that. And she was wise in that. You know, I do, you're right off some, but somewhere look at the big picture. You know, it's not worth a penny, not worth a dime, I don't know, but I'm just knowing what mine told me. And she
well,
was
again,
right.
it's going to be facts and circumstances over time.
Yes.
But
yes.
generally speaking, year in and year out, you're better off to save as much on your income tax side and then save away your own dollars in your own personal retirement account. But that may not work for everybody. Yeah.
Just to make sure that this is okay, but let's just say the church sends me to like a pastor's retreat on the district, and they just go ahead and write the check. And that, they don't, do they have to, is there something?
I mean, they're paying the district for you to go to the retreat.
I mean, because they're not paying me, they spend the district, so I'm not worried about anything, right?
They shouldn't be reporting that. That's a,
Okay.
yeah. And then any expenses you incur personally to travel back and forth
That's different.
should be reimbursed and also would not be income for you. So yeah, they shouldn't be putting that form in box 1 of Form W-2. Good question. Okay, so we're going to try to get our expenses reimbursed. You know, the reimbursements in the new law, miscellaneous deductions on Schedule A are gone. And so if you're trying to do that, it's going to be, it's not there. There's not a way with this forms to do that. The standard deduction for a couple now is $24,000 with an additional $1,250 per person. If you're blind or over age 65, and my wife is convinced that once I turned age 65, my eyesight did start failing. hey honey, where is what's right in front of you? That kind of conversation. The personal exemption is repealed, and there's a $10,000 cap on state and local tax deduction. So those things apply, and those things will have an impact. And being aware of that in structuring compensation is important. Here's the one, I'm waiting on the phone calls on this one. This is not going to be a pleasant conversation. Moving expenses are not deductible, and if they're reimbursed, they're treated as additional income. And the key idea, box one amount on Form W-2 is even more critical now than it's ever been. Getting that down from a tax perspective. Because trying to go back and deduct or rely on exemptions or whatever else used to be in the tax law to mitigate the tax impact of box one on Form W-2, a lot of those have been taken away. And so what you want to do is structure the compensation appropriately. We're not talking about tax evasion here. We're talking about appropriate tax avoidance under the laws as they've changed. And so that's kind of the point. Yeah.
Almost a similar question when asked before, but let's just say, I'm not planning on moving for a long time, but let's just say, Church A, I moved from Church A to Church B.
Mm-hmm.
Can Church B just go ahead and make the arrangements with the moving company if they decide to do that, they pay for it? I have to worry about it if they do it? Or, I know you're saying that if I pay for it, they reimburse me, we can't do it. But if they go ahead and they sign up for the moving company or whatever, they pay up front themselves, wouldn't they have to give me a form that I'll have to be taxed on that? Is that what you're
The
saying?
moving expenses that they pay are reportable in box one on your Form W-2. Whether you pay them and they reimburse them, or whether they pay them directly.
In other words, there's no way around it, you're stuck.
Yeah. I mean, next year, as people who have moved are doing their taxes, there are going to be some very angry people. All right? Let's just say it. And some of them may be called reverend. Now, these would not be Nazarene ministers, but there may be some ministers who are going to be very upset because the tax on their moving, the moving expenses may have been more than what their salary was. And they're going to have twice the tax that they planned on paying just because they relocated. Yeah.
But wouldn't that be true for anyone who's moving in any?
Oh, yeah, it's not
targeted against pastors.
It's not just ministers. Now, to the extent that ministers tend to move more,
This will limit that a little bit.
Well, we have discovered that tax laws do tend to affect things like that. Right after the economic downturn, I was having breakfast with the district superintendent. We were getting ready to go to one of these sessions, and I asked him, if you really want to get your DS upset and antsy and just kind of put them in a bad place, there's one question you can ask. So, how many churches do you have open? That's always the question, you know. So, I was at breakfast, and I asked him, so, how many churches do you have open? And this is a pretty good-sized district. And he said, none. I said, how did you manage that? He said, years ago, I started putting everybody on housing allowance. And with the downturn in the real estate market, they can't afford to move. They're all staying put. The Lord moves in mysterious ways. Who knew it would be section 107 of the Internal Revenue Code? So, yeah.
I am so sorry, but I want to go back to that parsonage thing. That's the thing I'm struggling with now.
I kind of picked up on that.
That's why, like, because I'm in a parsonage, I don't disagree at all with the tax benefits, because when my church hired me, they said, we're hiring you with the contingency you live here where we tell you to live. I have never quite understood housing allowance, and again, probably because I've always lived in a parsonage. To me, the housing allowance question, when you said that the tax code would
That's just the court case.
For me, that's why I understood, like, for presidents of universities or some of the military personnel, they're forced, you accept this job, you stay in this house.
Yeah.
So I didn't ever understand the housing allowance because that felt like it was being created for ministers. So I could understand why outside organizations or companies couldn't understand how pastors qualify for a housing allowance that's not translatable to other professions or other fields. I don't know if you want to address that or not, because I don't see the discrepancy of separating out legal code for parsonage versus legal code for housing allowance.
Yeah, at this point, it was just technicality in a court case. So, but it does separate, I mean, there are some denominations that basically don't do housing allowance, all right? Most Catholic churches do not pay housing allowance to their priests or any of their clergy that serve. They have a vicarage or a manse or, they have housing, all right? The housing allowance tends to be for Protestant denominations, and it tends to be not for the main line, because a lot of mainline denominations still have pretty nice parsonages, especially in high dollar areas, okay? And one of the arguments that was given in the case was, well, when you decided to make that division, you now have discriminated against particular religious traditions. And so that's kind of how that came into play, all right? I don't think it was philosophical as much as it was just the technicality of the court case. There is a section in the tax code, section 119, which addresses this issue of non-taxable housing if in fact it is a condition of employment, all right? We've been looking at, so what happens if the housing allowance goes away? How do we address that? And we've been looking again at section 119. Do we now, as you've explained, your understanding, do we now look at the parsonage as a condition of employment? And what rules would have to be met in order for that to be the case? So all of this stuff is just being opened up and reviewed, and I'm not sure there's philosophical consistency among it. It's just kind of, there's a friend of mine who is an attorney and has been working with legislators, legislative issues for 40 plus years, says there's two things you never want to see made: sausage and tax law. It doesn't make sense, and the deals that go into putting the stuff together do not yield stuff that makes sense. And I guess it could be argued neither one of them are really very healthy for you. But,
well, and I always wondered it, and this is not my forte, but like police officers, firefighters have to live within a certain proximity.
Yeah.
Like they're not told where to live, what house to live in, and so forth, but they're told that they have to live within this. So
they have to live within the county. They have to live within they have to be domiciled within.
Yeah. Now, do they get financial benefit tax-wise for having to live in a certain area?
No.
If they can't deduct it, how can churches get away with deducting?
Well,
I just always
You may not want to make that argument too much.
Yeah, don't make
so.
that argument, please.
I'm just saying, I can understand the other side because it doesn't seem to fit.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what the court says.
Okay.
And it very well could depend on how awake the 92-year-old judge was when the arguments were being made. If this thing comes down to a 2-to-1 decision, and you find that the guy that was sleeping during the arguments voted in your favor, just be thankful that there are lifetime appointments to the federal bench. All right, so then we look at fully tax-favored benefits, which is the first level of real compensation, and by that we're talking about benefits that would be free of both self-employment and income tax. Generally, those are going to be health and welfare benefits, life, disability insurance, health insurance, those kind of things. We've talked about the health benefit rules and how they're constantly changing, and to be aware of that. Our only caveat would be if a local church is going to set up their own benefit program, don't assume that somebody in your local church who is not either an attorney or a CPA specializes in this stuff is going to write something up that's going to work. All right? have to look like are pretty definite, and operating one outside the rules can be expensive if in fact you get audited, not your church, but you. So just be aware that if you're going to set these up, it's kind of like, don't try this at home kind of stuff. So anyway, if you're going to start getting dollars then, well, this would be your health and welfare benefits and also your 403B contributions. For ministers, 403B contributions, not subject to self-employment tax, not subject to income tax. We then look at partially favored, partially tax favored, and that would be the housing allowance. I think we've all kind of talked around that one. But oftentimes the churches will get these confused, and they'll want to do a housing allowance before they do the benefits that are fully tax favored. So if you're having that conversation and in the decision-making process, well, do you want us to put money away for your retirement, or do you want us to give you a housing allowance? From a strictly tax standpoint, this would be the argument that you would work on. There are other issues, but just from a tax standpoint, that would be what you want to look at. And then we're talking about fully taxable remuneration. The principles of thirds, we've kind of talked about what the percentages look like. But when it comes to setting compensation for clergy, that's kind of a challenge, isn't it? That's probably not the most favorite conversation you have with local churches when you do the reviews. It's a tough conversation. I don't think it's going to become easier. And I don't think 10 years from now, pastoral compensation is going to look like it does today. I don't think the pastoral service model is going to look like it does today. There are so many things that are changing, but right now, it's just one of those things that's in flux. And anytime you have something that's in a process of change, you're in discomfort and chaos, and unfortunately, it can yield some uncomfortable conversations. And Nazarenes don't hold grudges, but we have long memories, and they can kind of kick in. Just some points there that I think all of us are aware of. There's also a website there. We like to know what the Baptists are doing. It just kind of seems to be the question that comes up every once in a while. Well, the Baptists do put out a compensation study as well, and it's a lot more comprehensive than the one we have done. But it's driven by zip codes and job titles and church income and church attendance. I mean, there's all kinds of things that have gone into theirs. If you really want to, waste a morning, you can go to that website. I would suggest that you not purchase any of the products they're selling, because that does tend to be Baptist Sunday school literature, which probably shouldn't be what you're using. So, but that's a resource. And we talked about the bivocational pastor. One of the concerns I have with the bivocational pastor situation, and this is just kind of from anecdotal evidence and observation. If you're a bivocational pastor and you're living in a church-provided parsonage, I think your most valuable benefit is disability insurance.
As to what?
Disability insurance. Nobody thinks about disability insurance until they become disabled. I mean, that's an overstatement. But our actuaries have told us year in and year out, you're 7 times more likely to become disabled and not be able to earn a paycheck before age 65 than you are to die before age 65. Disability has the same financial impact in terms of generating income as death. The difference is, in death, your personal expenses tend to stop. In disability, they continue, right? But you still have lost your paycheck. And whether you're bivocational or single vocational and living in a parsonage, disability insurance is a big deal. Because if you become disabled, you not only have lost your salary, you've lost the roof over your head. And I've had just enough conversations with local churches where the pastor has become disabled and they're trying to figure out what to do. And here's their choice. We have to move our dearly loved pastor who has just become disabled because of, whatever it is. We have to move him or her out of their house. Because we can't afford to pay 2 salaries and have 2 parsonages. And we don't like what that means. What can we do? And at that point, you can't go back and buy disability insurance. All right? It's relatively inexpensive. The way we have structured the disability insurance, it's a flat dollar amount. It is not offset by Social Security. When you pay for the disability insurance through our program, you know exactly what the monthly amount is going to be. And so you could actually look at the cash or the fair market rental value of that parsonage and let that be a guide for what level of disability insurance you're purchasing. And you know right up front, this is the dollar amount that will be paid in the event of disability. Every conversation I've ever had with a church treasurer or secretary or local church leader where there was a disabled pastor, they would have gladly gone back and paid 5 or 10 years of premiums. It's too late, nothing they can do about it. So when looking at the compensation situation, don't overlook the value of that disability benefit, especially if you're in a parsonage and or bivocational. The other thing I'm concerned about with our bivocational pastors is retirement. I have heard way too many times from lay people, both lay people on boards and committees where I've interacted, and lay people that we talk to, well, our pastor's retirement is taken care of. They work somewhere else, and they have a wonderful retirement plan. So we don't even need to worry about retirement. The pastor's retirement will be cared for by their other employee. I worry about that because statistics show that 50% of employees in the USA, I'm talking about all employed persons in the USA, 50% of them do not have access to a workplace-sponsored retirement plan of any kind. Pension, 401k, whatever plan. The employers just don't have them. And so for a local church to assume that because a pastor is employed someplace else, he or she has a retirement plan, that don't go there. I mean, that's not right. And then secondly, whatever retirement plan they have is set up primarily to address replacement of earnings that they have on that job, not the replacement of earnings that they have on that job and some other employer's job necessarily. So while they may be adequately cared for the compensation they're earning over there, that may not take into account the compensation that the church has. Or they'll say, well, the spouse is taking care of that. The spouse's retirement plan is going to take care of both of them. Maybe, maybe not. And we need to challenge the assumptions, especially with the benefits that bivocational pastors receive, in assuming that they're adequate. How do we know? So, anyway, that's the stuff that we have there. There's the chart again. How we pay is important, and we're 1 minute over our deadline.
So one thing I was thinking of, and I think I know the answer to this, but you have the expenses and then you have the next thing, which was like the 403B. If you had an older pastor, by older, let's say 65 years old, and a church, with compensation funds their 403B, so that would not show up in box 1 as a W-2. But then when they take that money out of their 403B, it's taxed then.
Yes.
Is that correct?
If they have it designated as housing allowance under the current laws, it wouldn't be taxed then if they use it for housing.
Is it taxed for Social Security?
No. No. Distributions from the 403B accounts for ministers are not subject to self-employment tax
So,
under any
if you
circumstance.
save social security then by, I mean, again, let's say a pastor's making $7,000 a year. It's contributed to a 403B. It comes out as housing allowance. But then they don't have to pay social security on it.
Right.
Where if it was just salary received as housing allowance,
They still
they will
would
have to pay
so.
social
Yes.
security.
Yeah.
So that would be a way to maybe avoid the social security. Yes, sir.
That would be a technical way to do it, yes. We're not gonna call it laundering money, but, no,
But
no,
again, it would be
that's a
that,
strategy.
it would be that situation, that you would have to be a certain age where
Yes.
that can even be a possibility.
Exactly, that's the point, yeah, no. And you're right, it actually could happen that way. In fact, let me tell you one of the things that we think is happening. Is it okay if I go over like a few minutes?
Yes, sir. What you doing there?
What's that?
Yeah, I don't want to have laundry, go ahead.
Okay. There are some funny things that happen in our culture economically as you get older. Just you know, I mean, there's funny things that happen to us physically, but there's funny things that happen to us as we get older financially. One of the funny things that happens is when you hit age 65, you now are eligible for relatively inexpensive health insurance, right? So if you're age 64, you're responsible for buying fairly expensive health insurance. I mean, we're talking $15,000 to $20,000 a year for couples. You hit age 65, you now get Medicare. That $15,000 or $20,000 probably goes down to maybe $6,000 if you're going to buy a supplement with the Medicare. And that's not bad insurance. Well, that's a $9, $10, $12, whatever $1,000 windfall just by having a birthday, right? So we have a pastor, and he or she is serving, and they're 64, and the local church is trying to help them with their health insurance, and it's costing the local church $18,000, right? The pastor has a birthday, turns 65. It doesn't cost $18,000 anymore. What happens to the difference between what they now have to pay and the $18,000 that was going to pay? Does it just evaporate into thin air? It was compensation, right? In most situations, that now is being converted over to either salary or other benefits. Maybe not all of it, but it certainly is there on the table, right? So we have a windfall called relief from extremely high health insurance expenses to not as high health insurance expenses, just by having a birthday. Okay? And then they turn 66. Another wonderful thing happens. Now they can earn anything they want to earn, and the government will send them a check called Social Security. And so we have individuals who now have the government supplementing the income and providing relatively inexpensive health insurance. And quite honestly, between the ages of 65, 66, and at 70, there would be absolutely no financial incentive. I'm not talking just pastors. I'm talking about any self-employed person who would report it, to retire. Why retire? I mean, this is probably the best financial time of life in terms of working lifetime, right? So you now have this additional income, both from the health insurance windfall and the Social Security. We would think that this would represent a huge increase in 403B contributions for ministers when they reach 65 and 66, because now they have this additional income and they can put money away on a tax-favored basis, as you've noted, for retirement at age 69 or 70 or whatever it is going to be. And because there's this window of a few years of financial help from these programs. We've looked at the contribution behavior. It doesn't my fear. My fear is that if in fact that is happening, the additional income is being used to improve living standards, which, quite frankly, why not? Okay? And now the bar for replacing income in retirement, that is what you're trying to hit when you retire, has just been lifted. That is something that and I don't think that's just unique to clergy. I think that's happening. And as we see that beginning to happen, instead of taking advantage of what might be a windfall, and here again, once the Social Security benefit starts being paid, it's not subject to self-employment taxing. And so you can start receiving your Social Security benefit and reduce your salary by that amount, or near that amount, and put that money over into the 403B plan, and still, from an income standpoint, be at the same level, but be saving, you know, a few $1,000s a year for 3, 4, 5 years before you retire. And it could make a difference. Anyway,
Would you see on this as far as like a strategy? I've had some pastors ask me, you know, let's talk about, I'm going to, quote, retire. And that means one thing with Social Security, but over here with us in the Church of the Nazarene, that's another rate.
Right.
And so, for instance, when, I could retire Social Security at 65, 68, 70, but when should I retire within the status of the Church of the Nazarene? And those two do not have to happen, you know, simultaneously. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and there is confusion about what retirement means with regard to the pension and distributions from the retirement accounts versus the roll code status. Okay? The roll code on the credential. Okay? Once you reach age 65, you're eligible for Medicare without changing your work status if you choose to go that route. But you're also eligible to start receiving the old basic pension monthly benefit if you're grandfathered under the old plan. And you don't have to retire your credential to do that. All right? It's an age attainment only. It's not a retirement credential and age attainment. And so if an individual wants to do that, now you don't continue accruing benefit service under that. Once you start taking the benefit, you don't have to continue to accrue service. But you can do that and you don't have to retire the credential. All right? There's confusion. A lot of folks think, well, I sent in my paperwork to P&B to start taking my pension. Why isn't my credential retired? We don't do credentials. Districts do credentials. We don't do credentials. We just have age requirement out there. So that's probably some of the confusion. In fact, once you reach age 65, it's between the district and the individual on the retirement status. Now, if you're going to take the benefit prior to age 65, the pension benefit, we do require that the retirement status be kicked in, either disability or early retirement, just so we are better able to track that, and it actually makes things from a legal standpoint work a little better. Yep.
A question
Let me
about
take his, but he has his hand up first.
Can you delay taking the benefit even though you're 65? Like,
Yeah,
okay, you can.
yeah. As long as you're working, you can delay it indefinitely.
Okay.
If you're no longer working, we have to start paying it to you at 7.5.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
On our Social Security, we pay on our housing allotment. Does that Social Security help with our, money we receive when we retire? Do they factor that in? Or does that Social Security money go? Because if I was working a secular job, I made $30,000 a year. Social Security is based on that $30,000 a year. But I was just wondering, you got a housing allotment over here, $8,000 a year. They're charging you Social Security on that. Will that be factored in, I wonder?
Yes, it should be. Yeah, your earnings, look at your earnings record in your Social Security account and make sure that the earnings record with Social Security reflects not only your Box 1 W-2 income, but also the housing allowance you reported on Schedule SC. That's a good question, because if in fact, somewhere along the line in any particular year, somebody messed up and didn't get the numbers on the self-employment tax versus the box one, there could be an error in your earnings record. And your earnings record should reflect your self-employment, your Schedule SE income, not your box one income on Form 52. Yeah. All right, well, thank you. Yes?
Couple of real questions. You say 65 now. As the retirement age for the government goes up, like I can't retire when I'm 65, can we still do it through?
Yeah, we've kept the retirement age for full retirement benefit under the pension plan at 65. From an actuarial standpoint, we have funded to age 65, so there's no need for us to change it.
And then also you indicated memo 11. I just got on memo 11. That deals with the moving expense, the tax reimbursement, or the allowance for mileage reimbursement. If we're still doing a salary schedule approved by the board, and the board says, yes, out of what we pay you, that amount is a monthly, whatever your mileage was, you turn in the form. So that way it's factored in on lowering our income. We don't have to worry about the exemption being exempt, do we? The exemption being eliminated. Do you follow what I'm saying?
No, I'm not. I'm sorry.
You are aware of what a lot of churches do, unless that's been outlawed and I didn't catch it, a salary schedule, where you take what the board promises to give in a year and you decide, this is gonna go for insurance, this is gonna go for mileage, this is gonna go for this type of expense. And
Before it's paid.
Right.
Before it's paid, yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So then it's lowered to me. I don't get it. I just get a draw, but then each month as I fill out my report, they reimburse.
Yes.
So it's not an exemption for me, it is a lowering of income based on the salary
Right.
schedule approved between.
Yes.
And when I left the business world, I talked to the CPA firm who handled our corporate taxes, and Mary Beth, she kept in drilling it. Every time I asked a question, she said, Jim, it's whatever your governing body approves for you, that's your district, whatever the Nazarene district does. So that's what I followed through, as she said.
As long as that is worked out before the money changes hands.
It did.
Yes. If you go back and try
That
to
wasn't eliminated.
No. As long as,
That's
yeah.
what I
Yeah,
understood.
the caveat that I put in there was
I
if you
asked-
try to go back after the
I
fact,
asked
then you have a
D&D
problem.
a couple of years ago, and they said, no, that was not touched.
No, that wasn't. Still a.
Because at one time, East Ohio, Dave Johnson tried to incorporate that in everybody. So if I've got a problem with Roy,
Yeah. Should be okay. All right, well, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Let's thank Don for his time and wisdom.